Hi, everyone. Welcome to a PowerPoint on administrative agency law. Just want to take a minute and point out that we call this area of law administrative agency law. Later this semester, we're going to learn about something called agency law, which has to do with employers' responsibility for their employees' actions. That's a little different. This one's following here because it's this unofficial branch of government, this administrative agency law. So as I've already alluded to and as mentioned in your book, there are a number of administrative agencies. We could sit here for the rest of the day and just name all the administrative agencies. But here's just a few that are often household names, like the Food and Drug Administration, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. How about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission? That's the agency that regulates TV and radio. I even included pictures here of both Howard Stern and Janet Jackson because both of them have received fines from the FCC for indecent comments on the internet, not the internet, on the radio or on the television. And if you're not familiar with Janet Jackson's, just Google her infamous Super Bowl concert from 2004, and you'll find out why she, and I believe it was CBS, received a fine from the Federal Communications Commission. So there's a number of these federal agencies that all govern us on a daily basis. There's also state agencies. So like mentioned before, the Registry of Motor Vehicles that governs how you obtain your driver's license. Also, some of you, in addition to your driver's license, some of you might need a license to do your job. Like let's say you are a teacher, you need a teaching license. If you are a nurse or a dental hygienist, you need a license from the state to conduct that business. Even your barber or your hairdresser needs a license to do business. I, for example, do also have a license, not to teach, believe it or not, but I have one to practice law. So that way the state knows that I have completed the requisite schooling. I went to law school and I took an exam called the bar exam that says that I seem to know what I'm talking about in the law. And then I now pay dues to the state every year for the privilege of being able to be a lawyer. So that also all falls under administrative agency law. You can kind of get the idea that this is a lot of law. But here's the really interesting part. Where does all this law come from? The Constitution doesn't mention administrative agencies. We just finished talking about how the legislative branch makes laws, how bills are introduced and the governor signs them or the president signs them. Do you ever remember there being a bill introduced about a food regulation or a driver's license? That's because it's a different process. But just because this process is different doesn't mean the information is not publicly available. What I mean to say is all of this information about how administrative agencies make law is available to us in the public. It's just that often we're not paying attention unless we're in a directly affected industry. And I'll give you an example later in this PowerPoint. But let me just back up for just a quick minute or two and talk about how administrative agencies get their power and how they make law. As your book described, administrative agencies have both the power to make laws and interpret those laws. But when we talk about agency law, we actually don't use the word law. We use the word rule or regulation. I'm sure you've heard that term before. There's too many regulations. And that's because regulations are what we call agency rules. But keep in mind, an agency rule or an agency regulation also has the force of law. It is just as much a law as the law of Congress. And if you don't follow that rule, you're subjected to breaking that law and maybe receiving a fine or another penalty. So how do agencies make these laws? Here is the process by which agencies make laws. Agencies don't just act completely on their own. There's a lot more involved in agency guidance, but the process I want you to be familiar with has to do with how Congress, remember we just finished talking about Congress with their 435 members in the House of Representatives and the 100 senators, they pass statutes. But these congressmen and women can't be experts on every single area. They can't all be tax experts and food and drug experts and employment law experts. So Congress says, here, agency, we're going to pass what we call the enabling statute, and we're going to delegate, we're going to give some of that power to making the law to a particular agency, like the Food and Drug Administration. And then the Food and Drug Administration receives the direction from Congress, and they make a new rule or law. And there is some room for the agency to develop the law as the new regulation as it sees fit, but it's under the umbrella of this enabling statute. So what the agency does is they get together and they write a proposed rule. And you might be wondering who works at these agencies. Well, certainly a lot of lawyers do, but also a lot of subject matter experts. For example, at the Food and Drug Administration, you would expect there to be a lot of scientists, food scientists, pharmaceutical experts, biologists, all work at the Food and Drug Administration. So we'll stick with the FDA example. The FDA drafts what's called a proposed rule. Now, a proposed rule is very similar to a bill in that it's not a law yet. It's an idea for what the law will look like. But different than a bill that goes through legislative committee, the proposed rule gets published. Now, you don't need to know where it's published. It's in a book. It's actually a daily newsletter called the Federal Register. And people who are in affected industry pay attention to the Federal Register and they read the proposed rule. And they can say, I like this proposed rule, or I don't like this proposed rule. So people, including us, members of the public, can submit comments to the agency in favor of the rule, against the rule, asking the rule to be modified or changed a little bit. And that's called the public comment period. And members of the public includes regular people like us. And then the agency receives all of those comments and can make changes to the proposed rule. And then the agency issues the final rule. And the final rule I wrote on here, it has the force of law. So it is like the process by which the bill goes through committee and then gets voted on and becomes a final law. Such is the same with a proposed agency rule. The agency proposes the rule's published in the Federal Register. The public can read the proposed rule, submit comments to the agency. The agency receives those comments, can make changes to the proposed rule, and then publishes the final rule. And the final rule is what we have to follow. Just like we follow statutes of Congress, we follow the final rule. And yes, this process is made public, and you might be wondering, why have I never heard of it before? But the truth is, most of us in our daily lives don't think about it. But this process does exist. And a really good example before I get to the example that I have for you guys here would be the airline industry. The airline industry is regulated by the FAA, but also the TSA. And when the agency makes changes, for example, to how many hours pilots have to rest in between flights, that type of proposed rule will solicit a lot of comments by whom? Pilots, the airlines themselves, air traffic controllers, and us, members of the public. So that's actually what I want to focus on now, which is who's commenting, who cares about these rules? And as I mentioned before, it's the affected industries, the people that work in these environments, the people that own businesses in these environments, and members of the public who care about this. So let's walk through a real example. Now, you may have noticed that the last time you were at a restaurant, whether you saw the menu items on a big board or you had a menu in front of you, you may have noticed that in the last couple of years, restaurants have now had to post calories on the menu. Remember, I'm sure you can go around your house and find something where you have a food item like a box of cereal that might have the calorie count on the outside. But this is new, right? The idea that we see calories on a menu item. By the way, I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think about this? Do you like to see the calories on the menu, or you just want your big slice of pizza or your cake and you don't want to think about it? But did anybody wonder where this came from, that all of a sudden menus had to have calories on them? Do we think it was the good of the companies just saying, yes, we're Burger King and McDonald's and we want to remind you how many calories are in our food? No, of course not. It costs money to figure out the calorie count. It has to be, you have to reprint menus. So where did this come from? Believe it or not, this actually came from the Affordable Health Care Act. Remember Obamacare? Part of the Affordable Health Care Act was hoping to make consumers like us more educated about our food choices. And so that law told the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration Agency, to now order restaurants to put calories on the menu. Well, that sounds easy enough. So the FDA is going to say, okay, restaurants, you put calories on a menu. But now I have two questions for you guys, and you can pause the video here and think about it. Number one, what counts as a restaurant? Is every establishment that serves food considered a restaurant? Pause the video for a second and just think about where food is served, not just at restaurants, but at convenience stores, grocery stores serve not just the food that you purchase, but often have a hot bar, like a Wegmans has a big one. What about movie theaters? What about airplanes? What about schools that serve food? Are all of these entities now going to have to post calories? The other question that's related is not just who has to comply with this rule, but how do we do it? Do we have to put the calories for every single item? What if we have a special of the day? Or if we have pizza, do we do a calorie by the whole pizza or just a slice? And also, who really cares about having these published at all? Restaurants are being told they have to, but besides restaurants, who really would like to see these items on a menu? Maybe nutritionists, maybe individuals who work in the health industry. So you can see that just by the simple idea of, hey, restaurants, go put calories on a menu, there's still a lot for the agency to discuss in a public comment period. So what we have here is just a quick overview of some of the issues that did come up in the public comment period. The rule itself said that food establishments with 20 or more locations have to put the calorie count. But the agency had to discuss whether that included something like a movie theater or a school. Do they have to post the calories? And as I mentioned, the specialty items. One of the other issues that often comes up with agency regulation is how long do companies have in order to comply with this regulation? Because it's expensive. Companies have to determine the calorie count and then reprint all their menus. So now you can see that this process did complete. We went through a notice period, a comment period, and now the rule's been final for I think at least 2 years now at the time I'm making this recording, because you can go into Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, or even the Capitol Grill, and I believe there's calorie counts on the Capitol Grill, but you can go into any large restaurant with 20 or more locations and see the calorie count. And that's just one example about how an agency makes a law. So next time you think about things like, your menu items, think about how the agency law really affects every single part of our daily lives.